Hello and welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Death. I'm Fran Solomon.
And I'm Andy McNeil.
And we're thrilled to be your host for these conversations. Let's Talk Death is brought to you by Heal Grief, a social support network creating community after someone has died. Everything we do is inspired by our core belief that no one should ever grieve alone.
Our goal with this program is to have a friendly chat with some amazing people so we can help normalize and educate our Heal Grief community. Our guest today is James Mueller. James Mueller, a father of 3 children, grew up on a dairy farm in the beautiful countryside of upstate New York in the heart of the Mohawk Valley. After graduating from Cornell University, he attended seminary, obtaining a master's degree with high honors with an emphasis in pastoral care. With his son's condition challenged by the harsh winters in Chicago, the family moved to Delray Beach, Florida, where Jim established his consulting practice to provide governance, organizational development, and philanthropy counsel to organizations throughout the United States and the Caribbean. After losing his son only a few years ago, Jim turned his private journal into a book titled From Sadness to Wholeness, a Father's Meditation on the Loss of a Child.
James, we're delighted to have you as a guest on our show.
Thank you. Thank you.
Jim, you share with your readers that you've aptly described as lyrics of a broken heart and reveal the deepest emotions a father can experience from the loss of a child. I wonder if you could start by sharing more about that.
Yeah, I think for me it was a process of just opening up to the emotions that were somewhat locked away, even though I'm very familiar with counseling others. When going through this myself is quite a different experience, as anyone could probably imagine. So I found that the writing surprised me at what I discovered I was feeling. And because I think it can box it in, at least I could become very expert at closing that up and just sealing the box and leaving it there and putting it on a shelf. But I found I couldn't do that. I found that I had to start writing, and as I wrote, I discovered more about my own process of the sense of deep loss and how I was grappling with that and integrating it.
Can you talk about your son's illness and his end of life and how you and your family, for lack of a better term, coped with that?
Sure. Yeah, well, and Luke was born prematurely, and he was fine first few days, and then he started to get bleeds. And what happened very quickly was he developed necrotizing enterocolitis, and what that is the bowel starts to disintegrate on its own. The bacteria starts to form in the bowel, and the tissue falls apart. So they did an emergency resectioning of his bowel, and he went into shock. And he was there in shock in his little isolette, and we thought we were going to lose him. So my wife and I had him baptized according to my wife's tradition, and we let him go, but then he decided to stay. At the last minute, we weren't getting much sleep. At the last minute, one of the fellows from India, in fact, in the NICU, tried to do a blood transfusion through his umbilicus, and it worked. They didn't see how it would, and that changed it. So Luke got traction. He came out of shock. His kidneys started functioning again, and he surprised us all. But it's a challenge for any child to help develop something like that. The complications following being in shock are really what caused most of the problems. When he was in shock, he was lying on his back in his isolette, and all of the heavy-duty antibiotics and toxins pooled in the back of his brain. And so after a few weeks, we discovered he had cysts, and mostly in his occipital lobe, where the brain tissue had died. And so he would then was diagnosed as having, what am I thinking here? Cerebral palsy, excuse me. So all of his symptoms, he was spastic quadriplegic. So he was dependent upon mostly his mom for everything, that all the care, from feeding to changing to bathing, for his 22 years, nearly 22 years.
Wow, what a strong young man.
Yeah, he was definitely that.
Fighter for sure.
Yeah.
And you had the gift of his life for 22 years. How many years has it been since he died?
Exactly just 3 years ago, although it seems like yesterday. And I think people, that's a common experience, that time ceases to pass. It feels very immediate whenever I think about the loss.
You know, it's interesting you say that, because we at Heal Grief have the belief that once you're bereaved, you're forever bereaved. And that doesn't mean that you're spending every day grieving.
Right.
It does mean that there are triggers in life that just evoke the emotion of grief as if it were yesterday, especially when we're having these candid conversations as we're having now.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I can't even read my own book without losing it.
Yeah,
So.
of course. So in that spirit, feel free to feel whatever presents itself. But now, if you could tell us about your journey and your journal, and your book and your story about healing.
Sure. We altered the title just a day or two before it was put onto publication. It's called Lyrics of a Broken Heart, A Father's Journey Toward Wholeness. And I think that captured it all. I realized partway through the process that my heart was broken, that all this stuff was inside, and I needed to pay attention to it. So I think my journey was really allowing myself to grieve in the way that it came to me. I didn't censure anything, but moved with it and the emotions. And I was amazed at some of the lyrics that flowed out as to how I was feeling in that moment, and how it drew me. I don't know if the grief drew me down, but the recognition of the loss. I plumbed really the depths of the darkest spots in my heart, and just tried to experience all of those emotions and bring light to them. And by bringing light to them, I felt I was slowly moving forward, day by day. Even at times that I felt stuck, I could see that I was moving forward, and that I wasn't repressing these concerns and emotions. And I also learned not to judge myself. I think that was the most important lesson for me, is that I just needed to be where I was with this and allow it to have its course and move through me emotionally, and not try to block anything, but to continue to just write and express. And so I found there was at time turning corners. But I think the other very important thing I learned is how it disrupts the whole family. All of the family dynamics were different now. And I write about that in the book, about how my wife and I were challenged to find one another, because even kind words about our son months after he was gone were piercingly painful. And just to be able to acknowledge that. So there are a couple of different sets of lyrics where I talk about how moving through that process of just observing in some ways what was going on, because there wasn't really anything I could do about it except to experience it and make it a conscious process. I guess that's the best way.
Yeah, it's interesting you put it that way, and you use the word experience when you're talking about it. So often in just families that I've sat with over the years, and me myself, my own losses and struggles, is that grief really isn't a choice. It's something that happens to us. It really is an experience.
It's not a choice.
It's something we're living. It's not something that we're,
right.
It's not a problem. It's not a medical condition. It's not,
right.
It's this very real experience that's happening.
Yeah.
And it seems to me, just even hearing you talk about, the family dynamics that happened, having your son in the condition that he dealt with in his life, and as you said earlier, your wife was really the primary person then taking care of him and those things. You could see where after his death, everyone's sort of looking for that, like maybe even bumping into each other a little bit.
Yeah.
So as well, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about, I think it would help some of our viewers just to hear maybe some of that experience as how you all maneuvered around each other as a family, and how it impacted different people in different ways.
Yeah, I could I could read one of the lyrics I wrote, if that would kind of
Please.
bring
Yeah.
it to light. Give me a half a second.
Yeah,
Yeah, that would be great.
absolutely.
Yeah.
What a challenge where the wife actually loses the job.
So
Yeah. Right.
there was, just trying to find one piece that made sense to what we were talking about.
I just shared with Andy that it's almost as if your wife lost a job.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, that's for sure. That's
yeah.
true. That's true. Yeah, yeah. Um, and here's what I wrote. It says, when the fabric of emotional devotion becomes worn and threadbare through tragedies and cruel turns of life, can it still hold true amid the turmoil of loss? Loss that reverberates through memories of what once was, loss of identity and purpose and place, loss evident in the tattered and torn fabric of life that overwhelms the soul during moments of reflection. I wake from a fugue to a damp, dull morning as the fog clears to reveal a strange landscape. My sense of self evaporates with its mists. I am lost without and within. My true north is gone. And I go on to talk about the relationship with my wife when I say, I wake the sun to warm my bones, to illuminate the path toward a new paradise. I look to my intimate, my travel companion, wounded and sad. I touch her gently or not at all, for it evokes pain. Will she take another path? Will our discoveries lead us apart? Will our threadbare emotions find a healing balm, or will we remain forever lost to one another?
I am tearing up. How beautifully and eloquently written and expressed. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
And how challenging it is to put grief into lyric, right? Someone told me years ago, it was actually a friend of mine was going through something and said, I have discovered that grief really lacks a language. And it becomes very difficult. It's not just sad or mad or, all the things we think or emotions we attach to it. It's something else.
Yeah.
It's all of those things and more. And to express it and find the lyrics for that is certainly a challenge.
I think you captured it very well in what you just said. It's these complexities that crash into each other, these emotions that are hard to define. Yeah. I mean, when you lose a child and they're the center of your family, relationships are all altered and they need to be rediscovered. And that's a grieving process too, and a rediscovery.
And I'm sure with other children as well.
Right. Well, I write a little bit about my youngest daughter, who's 17, and she was sad that she didn't finish reading to Luke the book they were reading. And she still is hard for her to let go of that sense of loss herself that still hangs in the air. It's because it feels unfinished to her. So that process is just what it is, and no shortcuts, I guess.
Yeah. Well, that's probably a good way to put it. Is there really are no shortcuts. And you think about the time that went into your journal, and now I'm sure turning that into a book where others can be, reassured, supported,
That's the hope.
connected to. Yeah. I mean, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about just that process for you going through that, and now if having it come out, what are some of the hopes that you have with that?
Well, it was riddled with self-doubt. Let's start there. It's what I have to say of value to anyone. And after I shared one poem, we dedicated a fund to my son at the hospital where he received a lot of his care, and it's for palliative care for families of children with terminal or chronic illnesses. And I read one there, and people thought it was very powerful and I should continue. So over the next several months, it was that process of allowing myself to share this very intimate experience. But I found even those who read it found it extraordinarily healing, just to hear and to reflect. So it was a matter of of getting it out and having the courage just to lay it out there as it was, not to try to make it anything, not to make myself look any different. It makes me look vulnerable and raw, and that's just the way grief is. So hopefully in that honesty, there is healing, I hope.
Jim, I have a question for you. Do you feel during your journey that there was a bit of inequality in how people were tending to you versus your wife during that grieving process? The stigma for men to be strong?
Yeah, interesting. I've always been a very private person, so I'm not a good I'm not a good consultant on that particular question because I don't share a lot of my emotion. So I didn't notice the difference in inequality in terms of caring, but maybe it's because I'm so private anyway in my natural way of interacting with people.
I'm glad you bring up that point, Jim. One of the things, again, working with families over the years, is a lot of the support systems that are set up in our society for people who are going through a difficult time are focused on talking, emoting, revealing deep, seated thoughts and experiences. And not everyone finds hope or healing or comfort really in those things. And one of the things over the years, just in my own practice, was how do we provide space for people of variety of personalities and a variety of ways of experiencing the world, where comfort and healing and things like that can happen as well. So it's not shocking that writing really became a way for you to express that.
That's another very good point. It is true. I mean, that was my way of discovering about myself, because and that was the most surprising thing to me, was what I wrote and then read it and said, wow, that's how I really feel about this stuff. And I wasn't conscious of it until I wrote it down. And that was another reason of sharing it, is to help people recognize what they might be processing, because I know that if I stopped it up, I would be a basket case, right? And I talk about that in the cavern of my lament. There's a point in time when was so wounded and so sad and so sore, I stopped thinking about it. I started to refocus on my business. And so at one point I wrote a little bit about how I felt guilty about not thinking more about my son that was now gone. But I talked about it as having the secret place of all his memories that I'd open when I was strong enough to look at them. And so that was part of the process too, of allowing myself just to be. And that's my advice to so many, is allow yourself to be who you are in grief. But also, as you said, don't grieve alone. It's too hard to grieve alone.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that so many times, and people will say, others around me don't understand me, and a lot of things like that.
Right.
But we're often our hardest critic. Like we say this about others, but even in ourselves, just understanding ourselves,
right,
and what that means for us, and what I'm doing in reaction to this, and how that's impacting me and my relationships. We're sometimes even our worst enemy when it comes to that. Not just being patient with ourselves and allowing ourselves to be where we need to be right at that moment.
No, that was a fortunate aspect of this, because obviously my friends have deaths in their families, and the similarity of their experiences of how do you cope with people who are trying to be helpful but have no idea of what you're going through, right? And so it's a little clumsy. So you want to respect their attempt, but at the same time, you have to find your own way sometimes, and it can be a bit lonely.
I for one look forward to reading your book, your journal. I know I'm looking forward to that, and I can't help but think, just speaking with you and even hearing some of what you read to us already, that there are people who are watching this, or there are people who are going to encounter that, who also need to connect and hear from someone who gets it in a way that others maybe don't. So,
well, hopefully that's the hope, and I hope some good comes out of this little conversation we had here today.
So we only have a few minutes left. I did want to give you an opportunity before we end our conversation. I know people listening to us may be curious about how they can connect with you, connect with your company, with your writing. How might they do that?
Yeah, well, I have a website for my business, which is basically my name. It's jmuellerassociates.com, and that's that's kind of the central place for my business. We are going to create a website for this book as well, and as soon as that's put together, I will get word out about that. But J. Mueller at jmuellerassociates.com is the best way to reach me. And I should say I'm happy to talk with anyone who is going through the process of grieving. I'm happy to get on the phone. I'm happy just to be present. And I should say that quickly. Being present is the greatest gift people can give someone who's grieving, in my opinion. You don't have to talk, but be there and be present, be actively listening. And that is extraordinarily healing for those grieving. At least that's my experience.
Yeah.
It is. It is. Well, James, we want to thank you again for being our guest here at Let's Talk Death and for sharing your journey and the story behind your book.
Well, I'm happy to have, and I hope in any way I can be helpful. That's my intent.
Great. And for those of you who are joining us for this episode, thank you to you as well. If you would like to learn more about Heal Grief, please visit us at healgrief.org. At healgrief.org, you can learn more about all the programs and resources of Heal Grief, including our national network of support of grieving young adults called Actively Moving Forward.
Make sure you sign up on healgrief.org to receive our newsletter for links to future episodes of Let's Talk Death.
And with that, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time on Let's Talk Death.